John's energy is very, like his music, heightened and blazing at every minute. Every minute, all those nerves are moving, and that kind of da-da-da-da-da-da-da that's underneath all of John's music, that is going underneath John.
The way the orchestra is pretty much always churning.
It has that pulsating rhythm.
Driving energy.
If you had to put your finger on something that typified American music, whether that's jazz or rock or kind of music that I write, there's always this sense of pulsation. You always feel it. It's a very visceral feeling. What I do in my music is try to mix intellectual pleasure with what's fundamentally something that's very much from the gut.
John's music has still within it the skeleton of big band music, as well as the Bach cantatas.
My mother's stepfather owned a dance hall on the shores of Lake Winnipesaukee in central New Hampshire, and it was there that, as a young boy, I first heard big bands. I particularly remember hearing the Duke Ellington Orchestra.
As much as he has blazed the 21st century, it is built on a bedrock of our history, our American and European traditions. In a sense, he is a New England traditionalist.
Well, I grew up in a period when, among other people, Charles Ives was being discovered, and the idea of a New England composer, someone who loved Emerson and Thoreau and incorporated his philosophical feelings about life into his music, stimulated me and provided a certain kind of model.
In the 1970s, he escapes to California, not unlike Ginsberg or Kerouac.
My trip across the country was emphatically a journey of discovery. I'd grown up in a small town in New England where everybody had a name like mine and looked like me, and suddenly I found myself in San Francisco, and people looked different and spoke different languages, and their music was different, and I think it really opened the door to my own musical expressiveness.
There's a lot of amazing music being written in the kind of 70s and 80s avant-garde. But John was one of the very few composers who was building dramatic shapes.
The bottom line is that music is an art form about feeling. I think we tend to forget that, particularly in the era of modernism, where music has become very much a kind of intellectual activity.
When I graduated from college, I worked those summers at the Monadnock Music Festival in New Hampshire, and I met him there, and I said, let's do an opera called Nixon in China. And he said, I don't think so. And then a year later, he called and said, are you serious? I said, yes. He said, okay. And then we started.
We were opening a new opera house in Houston, and I was in contact with Peter Sellers, and I said, let's do something. And he said, what about Nixon in China by the composer John Adams? And I have to say, I said, you gotta be crazy. Nixon, Kissinger, Mao, Zhou Enlai as characters in an opera.
The most poignant, saddest, strangest people, and horrifying. And at the same time, you can't not be moved by them and respond to their horrifying, flawed humanity. And John was able to create music that let you get close to these people that you thought you'd never be close to.
Peter, John, and I, and Alice Goodman working together for the first time, given the opportunity to do a big and important opera about a recent event, was a miracle. We were all making it up as we went along.
Perhaps because we didn't know much about opera and we weren't intimidated by an overwhelming responsibility, we just sort of went in and did it.
Think of the topics that he has taken up. International détente, the remarkably thorny question of the Palestinian state, the moral dilemmas around the creation of the atomic bomb.
Certainly, the invention of the atomic bomb is one of the seminal events of recent history. That he would be brave enough to tackle such a subject and then to deliver it in a composition with such sensitivity and intelligence and dramatic power is a tribute to his talents.
At the end of the opera, he sets the countdown to the test. It's like all these clocks are chiming around the world, and America is giving birth to something that celebrates the best and the worst of its industry. It's the birth of something that will affect humankind forever.
Every one of John's pieces is addressing the agenda of our generation. John is writing the soundtrack for our activism, for our engagement, for our spiritual renewal, for refreshing our exhausted selves and going back in there on a battle that we should not concede.
Batter my heart. The composers of the 18th century, Mozart in particular, they were trying to get away from old topics and to write about things that were contemporary. I think it speaks to an audience that wouldn't normally attend the opera.
Dr. Atomic was a long haul and a really dark, nightmare corridor to get lost in. And the idea that you could open a door and you're in the garden, a flowering tree, that's just incredible. John has figured out the world will be saved by pleasure. Not by pointing a finger and saying to someone, you are horrible. Pleasure is going to be the thing that actually unwinds people from their own most toxic selves and creates this joy factor that is actually necessary for life and to sustain life.
Thank you, John, for giving me such a glorious opportunity to do what I was put on this earth to do.
John Adams' music is filled with this kind of joyous, beautiful, blazing life force that is not apologizing for how committed to life it is. And John chooses joy not as an escape, but as an answer.
What I like to call the great composers are composer heroes. If you look back at the 18th or the 19th century, the composer was the hero. It was the music he created that really turned people on. And John was the model for me in my life of a composer hero.